Good morning, everybody. I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. My name's Ayesha Hazarika. I'm a broadcaster, a columnist, stand-up comedian, and I'm a former Labour advisor. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this very important, very timely event, which is called 2020 Vision, Ending Child Poverty for Good. Now, we've got some fantastic speakers, real leading lights in their fields, and we'll have lots of opportunities for you to ask them questions. So we're basically, how it's going to be structured is we're going to be sort of hearing from different speakers, then we'll do some Q&A straight afterwards. So if you're listening to somebody and you've got a question, pop it into the Q&A box and we will come to it. We're also recording the session and we're going to make it available on the website afterwards. And if you are tweeting about it on social media, and please do tweet about it, let's make some noise about this, please use the hashtag 2020 End Child Poverty. So that's hashtag 2020 End Child Poverty. Now, this event is called 2020 Vision because in 1999, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair made a historic pledge to end child poverty by 2020. Now, we're all painfully aware that we haven't reached that target, and if anything, things are going backwards. And we know that there's now more concern than there has been in a long time about child poverty. And we know that we have to come together to try and move the needle on this. And it's so incredibly timely because, of course, of the coronavirus pandemic, which has heightened all the inequalities that so many of us on this call will have been, spending our lives trying to narrow. We know that there is heightened homelessness. We know that there is heightened poverty. We know that there is heightened hunger, not just for children, but parents, particularly single families, single parent families, foregoing eating themselves to try and feed their children. We know that there are physical health ramifications. And of course, we know that there are huge mental health issues that go along with the idea of poverty for parents, but of course for children as well. So it's going to be a really important, and as I said, timely moment to have this coming together and have this discussion. So you're going to hear today from one of the key architects of many of the policies that reduced child poverty in the 2000s. That, of course, is former Chancellor and former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. We're also going to be hearing from the Conservative peer, Baroness Stroud, on what the government's priorities should be. We're also going to be hearing from Torsten of the Resolution Foundation on how policy choices affect child poverty. We're also going to be joined by Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, Kate Green. She's going to be joining us a wee bit later on what the next Labour child poverty strategy should be. It's a very important time for Labour. They're beginning to formulate some of the contours that will eventually be the Labour Party manifesto. We're way off that, but the intellectual thinking is happening now. And finally, we're going to hear from Ben Lomas, who is a member of the Youth Parliament, and he's going to talk to us about his hopes for the future. So we've got a really excellent session with a real variety of voices and most importantly expertise. But first of all, I'd like to introduce the woman that's brought this all together, and that's Alison Garnham, and she's the CEO of Child Poverty Action Group, and she's going to give us a wee bit more context about how we've got here today.
Thanks, Ayesha, and welcome everybody today. I'm delighted to be here. As Ayesha said, this year marks the end of the 20-year target when we were due to have ended child poverty. Now, Tony Blair's speech was on the 18th of March in 1999. So we were exactly 21 years after that when we organised this event for the first time back in March to be held at Toynbee Hall, but of course we had to cancel it because of the pandemic. But anyway, here we are. We managed to get in before the end of the year, which is great. Now, at Child Poverty Action Group, we've been warning for years that we're facing a child poverty crisis. And I think if the COVID pandemic has shown us anything, it's really that we're now in the middle of one. The fortunate thing is that we actually know how to do something about it because we've done it before. The last Labour strategy showed us that poverty is policy responsive, and there's a lasting legacy from that strategy. You'll remember the policies that took place at the time, the introduction of minimum wage, the New Deals, financial support through tax credits, child benefit, help with childcare costs. We saw the first Childcare Act ever in 2006, which introduced the early years entitlement and extended schools, and investment in Sure Start. There were ambitious attempts across government to reduce health inequalities, to promote integrated education and children's services under Every Child Matters. And all government departments were involved in the drive to eradicate child poverty, led by the Treasury, and child poverty fell. And I think that's the important point. We know that child poverty is policy responsive. And child wellbeing improved on 36 out of 48 of the OECD indicators. Lone parent employment rose. In fact, we saw the biggest falls in child poverty across the whole of the OECD. Of course, not everything survived from that strategy, but a good deal of it has. We were halfway to getting to the 10% target, even if we weren't halfway to zero. And other countries learned from that strategy. So New Zealand, Canada, Ireland have introduced child poverty targets, and of course Scotland and Wales. They've even set up a child poverty action group in Washington in the United States to try and achieve the same. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is heading up their child poverty strategy. They're calling it a child wellbeing strategy. They've set ambitious child poverty targets, and they're held by her as Prime Minister. She's the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction. But seriously, they learned all this from us. And the New Zealand experience also highlights the importance of listening to and being led by families' experiences. And Jacinda Ardern herself even carried out her own listening to children exercise. So why do we need it again here? And I think the answer to that is probably obvious to many of you. We've seen over 50 cuts to benefits since 2010. We entered this year, according to the OBR, about to spend 36 billion a year less on social security than we were in 2010. Pensioners were protected and children weren't. And in fact, children's benefits have been targeted for cuts. Child benefit itself has lost 23% of its value since 2010 and is now worth less than half what it was worth back in 1979. So the net result is that child poverty has risen by 600,000. And although we saw big growth in parental employment, it's been no match for the opposing pressure from benefit cuts. And one of the most worrying things that's happened is that the depth of poverty has grown. So people have been moved further below the poverty line. Our analyst Tom Lee has shown that that increase has been even starker than the rise in child poverty, the gap rising by 30% between 2012 and 2018. And now, of course, we face rising unemployment as well. So the really positive thing at the moment is that we know public attitudes have changed and are now very much supportive of doing something about child poverty. And Marcus Rashford quite rightly sort of rode the wave of that, sensing quite rightly that the public was not up for seeing more children going hungry. But of course, there's no shortage of food in the UK, there's only a shortage of money. And that's why we need to set out again to tackle child poverty. So we produced our little book called 2020 Vision, Ending Child Poverty for Good, which you've all got a link to. And so you can see what we set out there as what we think a child poverty strategy should look like. We don't mind what you call it. You could call it a child wellbeing strategy, just so long as we do something and we do something that works. In our book, we've set out what the key elements of a strategy ought to look like: action across all government departments, a mixture of universal and targeted approaches, clear leadership and targets held by number 10, focusing on the children at greatest risk, so in particular children from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds who are currently at the highest risk of child poverty in the UK. We need to strengthen social security. We need to focus on decent work, pay and progression, universal childcare, including extended schools, because the biggest gap in childcare is still for older children, parents working atypical hours and children with disabilities. We need inclusive education, which addresses the costs of education for parents, secure homes, of course, and high quality universal services. There's loads in there, as you can tell, and I think there's enough for an additional event. And I think we will, in the new year, put on another event to talk a bit more about the detail of what's in this strategy. But the overwhelming case, I think, is that the case for spending is quite powerful. Money that goes to low-income families is spent in the local economy, and it's the best way to invest in recovery. When the COVID emergency comes to an end, we don't really know what the full effect will be, but we do know what we want for children and for our communities, and we do know what we want to do to prevent and end child poverty for good. We need to start a movement for change. And on that note, I'll pass back to Ayesha.
Thank you so much for that, Alison. Some really, really interesting ideas, and you're absolutely right. We do have to kind of start a movement, and I think you're right about Marcus Rashford. I think he really kind of started to help. He tapped into something the public were feeling, and he showed like incredible leadership. And you're right, this is about political will. And our next guest is somebody who displayed so much political will in the choices that he made when he was in government. I'm really, really delighted to be able to introduce Gordon Brown. In fact, it's my birthday today, and it's quite an honour for me to introduce Gordon Brown. I feel like that is like my birthday present of the day. So Gordon Brown needs very, very little introduction. He is one of the key architects of a lot of the policies that helped reduce child poverty in the 2000s. Some of the things that Alison talked about, from things like the national minimum wage, tax credits, even simple things as well, like tax credits going to the mother, which was really, really important. Investing in Sure Start. Sure Start was a really, really important mechanism. Early years intervention really makes a difference. And I'm really proud that when I worked in government as a special advisor on women and equality issues alongside Harriet Harman, Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister, and that helped deliver the landmark Equality Act. It was the last piece of legislation that the last Labour government ever got on the statute books. And hopefully, if that was the last one, the first piece of legislation that the next Labour government puts on the statute books will be a continuation of the fight for equality. So Gordon Brown, somebody who cares very passionately about eliminating child poverty across the United Kingdom here at home, but also internationally, as well as being Prime Minister and Chancellor. He's also the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and is a passionate advocate for the rights of the children. Now, Gordon, we're going to hear from Gordon now. He's going to make a speech, and there will be an opportunity for Q&A. So remember, please do use the Q&A box and do tweet about it, #2020 End Child Poverty. Now introduce Gordon Brown.
Good morning. Never-ending austerity and grinding poverty. That's the sad and tragic fate this Christmas of more than 4 million children who have become the forgotten victims of the COVID crisis. Poverty in the Britain of the 2020s now wears a very young face, and more than 3 million of poor children are in families where someone is working. And the poor of this lockdown generation are sinking into deeper poverty, facing a Christmas without cheer and a New Year without hope. And so while it's a privilege to speak at this major anti-poverty event organised by Child Poverty Action Group, which has for more than 50 years been a beacon for fairness and the social conscience of our country, it makes me sad, angry, and determined not to remain silent when, as the Child Poverty Action Report 2020 vision states, 1 in every 3 of this country's children could soon be in poverty. I would like to have spoken on the history of Child Poverty Action Group, on the pledge 20 years ago to end child poverty, what we learned from our successes and failures over the years, but it's necessary to speak today about the urgent crisis we have this week, this Christmas, this winter. Already 44% in lone parent families are in poverty. That figure for children is set to rise to 50%. Already 43% of families with 3 children or more are in poverty, not least because the cap on benefits for families with more than 2 children, and soon it will be 50%. And nearly 1 in every 2 of children in BAME communities and in many inner cities and industrial town estates are facing poverty. And as unemployment rises, we know that already 80% of the children of the unemployed are in poverty. And yet the biggest number of poor children, 3 million, are in families where someone is working and not earning enough. I've long been involved in the Kirkcaldy Family Centre in the constituency where I grew up and which I represented for 32 years in Parliament. In 2011, at the start of the last decade, the Family Centre had to help 100 children at Christmas. This year, it will be nearly 1,500 children. Then in 2011, the help was with extras like Children's Choice for Christmas. Now the help is to be with basics, food and clothes. For the poor are getting poorer. We are now seeing worsening, deepening, mind-destroying, humiliating, grinding poverty. Poverty I did not ever expect to return in my lifetime, nor scar Britain in the third decade of the 21st century. An estimated 500,000 children and more of the 4 million children in poverty are, say, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, destitute. That is, that they lack 2 of the basic necessities of life. And every day, the army of the child poor is being enlarged, with thousands of new claimants of universal credit and a new generation of the unemployed. Indeed, the number of poor children in unemployed households is likely to double because of the pandemic. The arithmetic of deprivation should shock even the cabinet. 8 million households are in debt. 6 million households are being pursued for payment of at least one household bill, with more turning to food banks, baby banks, clothes banks, with twice as many children dependent on food banks in this year, 2020, than in 2019, as the welfare state is now being replaced by voluntary organisations and social security by charity. And I cannot see how the Prime Minister, and indeed any Chancellor, can now justify subjecting 6 million families this Christmas to the anxiety and fear that their universal credit benefits will be cut by 1,040 a year in 12 weeks' time. That cut would hit 80% of already struggling single-parent families and almost every family of the unemployed. They would either not receive the £20 because they're on legacy benefits or would have it taken away at the end of March. 1.5 million single-parent families with children, 1.8 two-parent families would lose. Cutting it away would push between 200,000 and 300,000 more children over the edge into poverty. So the way forward is clear. Extending the £20 universal credit payment, including to the 6 million who have it, and pay it to those still denied it, like the self-employed and the disabled currently on legacy benefits. Make the social security system child-friendly by raising child benefit and child tax credits and by removing the 2-child limit. You know, this month, banks have been given their Christmas present from the government. They are being given permission to pay out dividends. But hungry children have been given no hope that in 2021 they will even have the inadequate support they receive today. To announce a change of heart on universal credit and on children's benefits would be the best Christmas present families could receive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gordon. Now, I think we have got some time now for questions for Gordon and Alison. I think Gordon has joined us. Hello, Gordon. Thanks very much for that. So,
happy birthday. It's your birthday today.
Thank you, Gordon. Well, it's the best present to be able to have the honour of speaking to you on this very auspicious day about this very important issue. Now, we've got a really excellent question that's come in from Louisa McGeehan, and she has said, we used to have a problem with in-work poverty. Now we are facing widespread unemployment again. How can we make sure that parents, and lone parents in particular, get the support they need to get back into work? And how can we make sure it pays enough to avoid in-work poverty again? Great question, Louisa. Thanks very much. If anyone else has got questions, do use the Q&A function. Gordon, I'll come to you first on that.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak alongside Alison, and thank you for your initial remarks, and thanks for what you do as head of Child Poverty Action Group. It's a great organisation, and also Marcus Rashford has inspired us by focusing on nutrition and on food. But as we know, and as he knows, the problem is bigger than simply the provision of meals. It is the poverty that denies people shelter, denies people clothes, denies children the chance to develop the potential. So, you know, 50 years ago, we would have been talking about old people in poverty as one of the biggest problems. Now it's child poverty. A few years ago, we'd have been talking about the unemployed as the biggest group of families where children were in poverty. Now it's people in work. What's going to happen, however, in the next 2 years is that we're going to have a large rise in unemployment, and therefore children, almost all children of the families of the unemployed, are pushed into poverty. And we've still got this problem of low pay, insecure work, 0-hour contracts, people not being able to make ends meet, even although sometimes 2 of the family are working full time and simply not earning the wages that they get. So first of all, the unemployed. Let's make sure that the back to work programs of the government are good enough. I've looked at them and they're not good enough. They've got to improve them, both for young people and for people who are likely to be long-term unemployed. So that's something that needs to be done. In work poverty, I've always thought that you need 2 things. You need to raise child benefit so that the floor is that everybody gets a universal benefit. And the support for that, as Alison said, throughout the country. People understand the importance of child benefit, paid mainly to the mother, and it should not be falling as a share of household income or the share of the costs of bringing up a child. I've always thought child tax credits should come on top of that, so you get more to those families who need it most, on top of the universal benefit, child benefit. The problem with universal credit is that whatever the original idea that you could harmonize all benefits and integrate them together, this is simply a series of cuts in benefits that is being imposed on people through the adoption of universal credit, people being shifted from old benefits to new benefits and being worse off. And therefore, universal credit is turning out to be a disaster for so many families who are being pushed onto it. Denied benefits for 5 weeks, having to take loans, then in debt, and then, of course, the 2-child rule, which is a ridiculous and unfair imposition on people, that the minute you have a 3rd child on a new benefit, you're losing some of your support for children. So we need help for those to get back into work, and that means that we've got to improve the back to work programs, and we need to build child benefit again as a universal benefit, and on top of that, child credits. And people say, well, you can't afford all this. And I say, if you don't get the economy back to growth by getting people back to work, and if you don't have spending power in people's pockets over the next few months, the economy will not return. And to take away 6 billion out of the economy in March would be to depress demand in the economy and probably lead to large numbers of people additionally being put out of work. But if you could spend, what, 750 million over the summer on the Eat Out scheme, you could spend 750 million on the poorest children in this country.
Thank you very much for that. Alison, do you want to come in off that? There's also another question which is specifically for you. Do you want to respond to what Gordon was saying?
Yes, well, the only thing I'd add would be that we actually have a lot of excellent evaluation of the new deals and employment support programs, and one of them, of course, was the New Deal for Lone Parents, which actually was a voluntary scheme, but it doubled lone parents' chances of getting a job. So there's a lot we can learn from what we've already done.
And actually, this question follows on quite neatly when you're talking about evidence. This is a question from Salma Hamid, and this is for you, Alison. And she asks, what effect has universal credit had on child poverty? Is there any data collected around this?
Well, of course, we know that child poverty has risen, and one of the big problems with universal credit was it wasn't introduced as it was intended to be. It was cut quite severely very shortly after it was introduced, and then in 2015 there were more cuts. We did calculations about that at the time, and lone parents were losing about £2,380 a year, which for people on sort of average incomes, sort of less than 15,000 a year, is an enormous amount of money to lose. Couple families were losing about £1,000 a year, and that was just from the cuts to universal credit. So we know that this has played into the increase in child poverty, and we've been arguing for some time now that we need to restore these family benefits. It's precisely there that we need to put the help for families with children. Thanks very much.
So we've got thanks so much for getting loads of questions in. Let's have this is a question for you, Gordon, from Sophia Parker. I run Little Village, a London-wide baby bank. My big concern is how few people are aware of the national crisis of rising child poverty. It feels like a catastrophe happening behind front doors. And where there is awareness, there's often judgment, a belief in poverty, a belief that people in poverty are there because of their own failings, and this horrible notion of the undeserving poor. How do we build a groundswell of public support for measures that tackle child poverty? And what have we learnt about this challenge from past work?
That's exactly, I think, the challenge. And thank you for this question that has got to be met, because we know from the U-turns that the government have done on other things that they will respond, or will be forced to respond to public pressure. But unfortunately, children seem to have been the invisible victims of this COVID crisis. We've talked a lot, rightly so, about the dangers to the health of old people. And we've talked about people who are not able to get to work because of the furlough, because of the having to use the furlough scheme. But we have talked very little, and there has been no specific benefit announced for children during the last 9 months. And if you take the universal credit benefit, £20 was welcome to families on universal credit. But if you're a single person on universal credit, you would get £20. If you've got 4 children, you get £20. And therefore, the amount of money available to a family with children was obviously a lot less as an addition than the amount available in practical terms to a single person or to a couple without children. So we have not done enough for children. Now, what Marcus Rashford did, and to his great credit, and I've been talking to this great campaign that he ran, was focus on hunger, and focus because of his own personal experience, and because he really did speak from the heart. He got through to millions of people when he talked about the need to do something to prevent children going hungry. And he talked about going to bed hungry, getting up in the morning hungry, what it meant, how it affected his childhood, and how he felt sorry that his mother was not in a position, I think until tax credits came along, to be able to do more for him as a young person. And so I think we've got to build on that experience. And I know Marcus is continuing his campaign, although there is now money for Christmas meals when schools are off. That is not going to be enough to get children out of poverty. And he knows that, and he's arguing for more measures. And I think we've got to build on that and say, look, every child matters, every child's special, every child's unique. We cannot allow this crisis to destroy the opportunities for large numbers of children in this country who can't go to school sometimes, and then can't use the internet because they don't have it, cannot get the benefit of Sure Start now because that's gone, cannot get the benefit of a whole series of measures that we including educational maintenance allowances for teenage young people in England, which have gone. The savings scheme has gone. So we've got to rebuild this sense that as a community, as Alison said, if we could tackle child poverty 20 years ago and 15 years ago, we can tackle it now when children are in a far more difficult position and facing far more difficult prospects. You see, leveling up is the government's phrase, but children are at the moment being leveled down. What's going up is unemployment, poverty, destitution, homelessness. And we've got to be able to create a public opinion that makes people aware that in every community of this country, 1 in 3 children are in danger of falling into poverty.
And Alison, just to bring you in on that, I mean, you've been at the front line of campaigning on this. How do we galvanise the public? How do you, I mean, as you and Gordon have said, the Marcus Rashford intervention was incredibly powerful. But how do we keep this going and make it a key political priority in amongst all the other pressures of the pandemic?
Well, I think there's lots that we can all do. I mean, everybody here can kind of sign up to our campaign to try and make a difference. There's the End Child Poverty Coalition that organisations can also join. The good news is that public opinion is really changing on this. You can see in the British Social Attitudes survey that some time ago people started to change their view about, whether people were to blame for their poverty and whether you should tax and spend more. So we're with the wind of public opinion. I think there's also a lot of scope to work cross-party, and I know that there are people in all political parties who are now very concerned about what they can see in their own constituencies. They know that family benefits have been cut too far, and something needs to be done to restore them. So I think we need to all work to get support across party to end child poverty.
Excellent. Got loads of questions. We're going to try and get them done quite quickly. Gordon, this is a question that I'm going to put to you. This is from Helen Stockton, and she makes a really good point about as well as, you know, hunger, a lot of children are living in fuel poverty, and also schools are often on the front line of providing support to children in poverty, way beyond just meeting their educational needs. So how can schools be better supported to help children in poverty? And also your views on you know, the idea of schools closing right now. Do you think schools should still be open, or do you think it is time for classes to maybe sort of move online?
I think we want schools to be open as much as is humanly possible. I think the issue as far as schools concerned is we support and should be supporting breakfast clubs, the extension of school meals, because free school meals are not available to a lot of people whose families are in poverty. It is not as generous as it should be in the ability to draw on school meals. And when you've lost these other benefits, school meals become even more important. I mean, I would like to see something like Sure Start re-established. Now, Sure Start was based around community centres, but sometimes around nursery, preschool and everything else, and something ought to be done there as well. I think when we look back at this crisis, we'll be quite shocked. You know, you judge a nation by the way it treats its old and its young. And I think we have done what we can, even though there's been a terrible scandal in old people's homes. We've done what we can to protect the financial position of pensioners, but we've done nothing to protect the financial position of children. And that's why I think we should really try to alert the country that this is a two nations problem. If you neglect the children of poor families, you're building up massive problems for the future.
Yeah. Alison, is there anything you want to add to that about schools?
Yeah, I mean, we've been working in schools throughout the pandemic and spoken to thousands of parents and children, and it's obvious that parents are really struggling, sort of struggling with the double burden of either trying to work and look after children, or in fact losing their jobs because parental leave isn't properly available so that they can retain their work. And so lots of people have lost hours or lost jobs altogether. And of course, this has really exposed how many children find participating in education expensive. So the need to be able to work online is a problem in itself. We didn't see the computer, the laptops distributed as quickly as we would have liked to see. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the costs of education. You know, if it's going to be a truly universal system, it shouldn't involve cost for families.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, the whole working from home and schooling from home has absolutely shone a light on the haves and the have-nots. It's fine if you've got a big house, you've got lots of space, you've got very good broadband. It's a nightmare if you're in a cramped flat. I mean, somebody mentioned into my radio show, messaged in saying just the cost of printing, you know, a lot of the materials for kids, and just things like having a decent printer and the printer ink and things like that. There's just so many costs which you know, are sort of hidden costs. Right, we're going to crack on now. This is from an anonymous attendee, but Gordon, this is a question which I think would be useful for you. He says, I don't know if it's a he, might be a she. Gordon Brown says, absolutely right to say that the £20 per week uplift needs to be made permanent. Obviously there's universal credit, but it also needs to be extended to legacy benefits. The 2-child limit also needs scrapped, but could we also look north to see some ambition too? The new Scottish child payment has been described as game-changing by Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. Should we be calling on the UK government to match that ambition?
Well, I did say in my speech that we had to deal not only with the £20 that has got to be retained on universal credit, but it's got to be extended to the legacy benefits, and that includes disabled children, disabled families. Equally, the 2-child limit is, as I said, insidious, and it's completely unfair, and it's got to be removed at some point. I'm actually disappointed by the delays in the Scottish poverty payment, and I don't see why they created a completely separate social security system to administer it when it could have been administered through the Department of Work and Pensions. You've got to remember that we were, when in government, we knew that to get families out of poverty, you have to spend sometimes an extra £100 a week for 3-4 children. That's what tax credits were doing. So we raised child benefit, and tax credits would give families 20, 30, 50, sometimes £100 extra to make ends meet. The Scottish Child Poverty Payment, let's be honest, is £10. It will probably cost £2 or £3 to administer. It could have been done far better. I'm afraid I cannot share the enthusiasm for this measure, other than it's a recognition of the problem of child poverty, but we have to do better in all 4 countries of the United Kingdom. Nowhere is poverty falling. Everywhere child poverty is on the rise.
Thank you very much on that. I've probably just got time for one more. I mean, this is an interesting question. This is from an anonymous, how do we, one party just can't be, I suppose, the custodians of this. If we want to see change, we do have the government we have in Scotland and of course in Westminster. So someone has messaged in, how do we best encourage fair-minded Tories to help with this mission? Alison, do you want to go first on this? Now I'll bring Gordon in.
Well, I think there's a lot of Conservatives have already made public their concern about this. There are many who want to keep the £20 uplift, for example. They're aware in their own constituencies of the problems families are facing. Nobody's happy about seeing food banks, development of food banks, which has kind of been the problem of our age in a way. That and this is just one expression of deprivation that's caused by child poverty. And of course, there are many more, being unable to pay your debts and so many other things. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to talk right across party, to encourage those people to see child poverty as the problem, because that's clearly what it is. No amount of food charity is going to end child poverty. What we need is the kinds of things we're talking about today. We need to restore children's benefits, get rid of the benefit cap and the 2-child policy, and yes, keep the £20 uplift.
Gordon, what are your views on this? How does this become cross-party?
Well, it's a matter of conscience, and I think people in all parties will feel very worried that we're going into Christmas with families with this £20 cut a week and the benefits hanging over them. The Chancellor could have eased that problem by announcing that it was going to continue when he made his statement. But look, I want parties to work together on this. This is a national mission. This is about all of us and about the kind of society we want. It's not just about one particular group, and it's not just about one particular nation. It's about all of us. And if I was in charge at the moment, I would be bringing together the Scottish, the Welsh, the Northern Irish, and the UK administration. I'd be holding a summit on child poverty and about what we can actually do about it. I bring in the mayors from the Conservative side, like in Birmingham, the Labour side, the Liberal side. I bring them all into this debate, and I would try to build a national, not just a national conversation about what needs to be done, but a national consensus about what we need to do together. Now, so it's not misunderstood. I welcome every advance that is made in paying more for the benefits that are desperately needed by children, like the £10 payment in Scotland, but we could do far better, and we've got to do far better. You cannot allow a family to see what could be a £20 a week cut in March. Moving from legacy benefits to universal credit could mean, as you just said, £45 a week for a single parent family that you were mentioning, benefits that were lost. We cannot live in a society where some people are doing so well out of making huge profits during this COVID crisis. The tech companies, all these people in logistics, and all sorts of people making huge amount of money, dividends being repaid now, having been stopped for a few months. But we are seeing children going with less, and it's really children with less, and it's poverty that is now worse than it was, and it's poverty that is simply not acceptable. So I would like to build a national consensus, and that was what the point of creating that child poverty target in around the year 2000 was, that we'd all be part of a national mission to abolish child poverty and rid the scourge of child poverty from our country. We've got to get back to this sense that you cannot build a society that is inclusive and works unless you bring everybody along together, and that means every child matters. Every child's got to be taken into account. every child has the right to bridge the gap between what they are and what they have it in themselves to become. And you can only do that if you can take children out of poverty.
Thanks so much for that. Absolutely right, Gordon. I mean, it does feel like now is the time to try and bring people together from all sides, and I do hope that that is something that the government will pursue. Final question, just for me, very, very quickly, is what do you think will the impact be of Brexit, particularly if we get a no-deal Brexit, on all the issues that we've just been talking about?
Well, we're going to be worse off. I mean, everybody who looks at this with the information they have knows that it's going to take a long time to recover from the loss of trade with certain parts of Europe and certain industries in Europe. And it's going to be more costly for people who are buying food in the shops. It's going to be more difficult to get medicine into the country certainly if there's a no deal. And I just hope at this last minute that the government will realize that it's not in their interest to have an economic war with Europe. It's not in their interest actually to break relationships with the United States, because President Biden to come is actually saying that we should be part of this, well, at least avoiding a no deal. And you know, I worry because we're falling out with Africa because we're cutting overseas aid. We're falling out with China over all sorts of things which may be justifiable. We're falling out with Europe and we're falling out with America. It's really not a very good way to end the year and to start the next year. So I hope a deal is struck, and it would be, in my view, the greatest failure of international statesmanship if Europe and the United Kingdom couldn't actually arrange a deal that avoided chaos on January the 1st.
Yeah, no, I think everybody will agree with you on that, and it's not a great way to end the year talking about bringing out the gunboats in terms of the English Channel. But listen,
the good thing about the end of this year is that vaccination is possible and that we can see a way to eradicate this disease. But of course, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be continuing to test. And I think one of the problems in London at the moment is that in the schools that you wanted me to talk about, which I don't know enough about, but certainly what we do know is that testing could have made a bigger difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually had teachers ringing into some talk shows this morning saying that they hadn't had testing and they wish they had done, and that would have made a big difference. Well, look, we're out of time. A huge, huge thank you to Alison and to Gordon Brown. That was a really, really interesting session. Great talk from Gordon, and really insightful, thoughtful questions from all of you. Sorry I couldn't get through all of them, but I did think we covered most of the themes that were coming up in the Q&A. So thank you very much. I know Gordon probably has to sort of dash off. Alison's obviously going to stay on the line, but we're going to now move on to our next group of speakers.
And thanks to you, Ayesha. It's your birthday and you've taken...
Yeah. Happy birthday. 2 hours
out of your birthday celebration.
This is actually a really nice thing.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Because there's nothing else for me to be doing other than enjoying Tier 3 and the thought of a new mutant strain. Like, happy birthday.
Maybe we can invite you back to Scotland sometime when...
well, that would be lovely.
Over. Take care.
Look, we're going to move on to our next set of speakers. And as I say, we've got some real experts joining this webinar today. So we're really, really lucky to have them. And we have Baroness Philippa Stroud and Torsten Bell. Philippa is CEO of the Legatum Institute, and she was previously the Chief Executive of the Centre for Social Justice. She was also a special advisor to the Right Honourable Ian Duncan Smith, while he was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions for 5 years from 2010. And Philippa is going to be talking to us about what this government's priorities should be for tackling child poverty. And after that, we're going to hear from Torsten Bell. Torsten is CEO of the Resolution Foundation, which is a leading independent think tank looking at how to improve living standards, particularly of people on low and middle incomes. Previously, Torsten worked as a director of policy for the Labour Party under Ed Miliband. Full disclosure, Torsten and I actually used to work together in that happy or not so happy period. And Torsten's going to be talking about how the different policy choices that are made now will affect child poverty in the coming years. So two really excellent speakers with lots of kind of real expertise in their area. So first I'm going to ask Baroness Philippa Stroud to talk to us about the government's priorities.
Ayesha, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And Just wanting to say thank you to Alison for everything she does at the Child Poverty Action Group as well. I can remember when I used to listen to the Gordon Brown budgets. I was running a hostel for homeless people in Birmingham at the time, and every announcement in the budget seemed to end with the line, which means a further 100,000 children will be lifted out of poverty. And in 1997, I can remember Labour literally erupting to power with a scale of ambition and drive to eradicate child poverty. The commitment, the fight and the passion were all inspirational. And as they came out, I read all the Opportunity for All documents when Andrew Smith was Secretary of State for the DWP and tracked with the strategy as it was being developed. But as I look back, I have to ask myself the question, what went wrong? Not to point the finger, but so that we can lay out a way forward together. There are two areas that for me characterize what went wrong. And the first is that it became Labour's fight rather than everyone's fight. And second, it became about what government could do rather than what we could all do together. We're each responsible for our own lives and our family's well-being, and everyone in society is responsible for their neighbour. These are the human truths at the heart of any poverty strategy. But I have been asked to outline what I think the government's priorities should be for tackling child poverty. The question itself reveals the focus that exists on government as the sole actor. The first point is that government is a motivator, an enabler, a powerhouse for galvanizing action. But a full poverty strategy needs government, yes, but it also needs every player and every lever available. The strategy needs government, and government needs to think about the levels of adequacy and dignity it provides. We have seen, for example, the power that a £20 uplift in universal credit has to lift families out of poverty. But it needs the marketplace. We must not forget that it has been global trade that has lifted 2 billion people out of poverty worldwide. And if we want to see jobs and future industries that create the jobs of the future, we need to understand how the market works and not constantly attack it. It needs employers. It is employers and businesses that give people the wages and dignity to find their pathway out of poverty. But we need to encourage employers to ask themselves the question, can my employee actually support their family on this wage? Not just what is the minimum I can pay subsidized by the state, but what is an appropriate wage? And it needs individual agency. If I'm in poverty, I'm asking what can I do to upskill and take on the opportunities that are standing in front of me? Or where are the opportunities that will make a difference to my family? These are the big players in any full poverty strategy, but what are the characteristics of a poverty strategy that are important? First, whilst a child poverty strategy is important, I would recommend we fight for a full poverty strategy. I know it sounds obvious, but no child is poor outside of their family. And what happens in and to their family has enormous consequences on the life of a child. If you make it about child poverty, you exclude a number of possible levers that are at the root of what can be done to effectively build a path out of poverty. Second, it needs to be a cross-party strategy and not a single-party issue. Eradicating poverty is a long-term business that will go through different government cycles. Poverty has become one of the most divisive political issues, and this has to stop. There are people in all parties who are committed to improving outcomes for children and the most disadvantaged, and we need to come together. Third, a strategy needs to use every lever at our disposal. We need to pull every lever to increase the income of a household through welfare, yes, through salary levels, yes, and through increased skill levels. We need to pull every lever to decrease costs for households through using the power of the market and lowering the costs, for example, for disabled people and for childcare. And we need to reduce the length of time someone is in poverty for. The best predictor of whether someone is in poverty in the future is whether that person is in poverty now and how long they have been in poverty for. We must ensure that our support programmes are not just a safety net, but rather are a trampoline that enables people who find themselves in poverty to get out fast. And then we need to ensure that people have the opportunity to improve their daily lives, their lived experience. That support is available to strengthen and support fragile families to stay together, keeping 2 incomes coming into a household. That people are able to put down roots in a community where they can strengthen their relationships and their children can be in stable education settings, ending the lost learning opportunities through constant moves, and to ensure that education is a genuine gateway to a life beyond poverty, a path to prosperity. And to ensure that a shield of protection is put around families that experience the drivers of mental ill health, to ensure that a generation is raised up to be resilient and able to create their own pathway to prosperity. 5 minutes to lay out a strategy when the best intentions of men and women have only partially succeeded over 20 years is not much. But if there is one thing to take home, it is this: we are still hugely ambitious and focused on ensuring that the men, women, and children who experience poverty today have every opportunity put in their pathway so that they too can fulfill their potential and build a future for themselves and the next generation. I am hugely hopeful, but let's put the old divisions behind us and work together to create a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Really interesting points there. If you've got any questions that you want to put to Philippa, please do use the Q&A, and likewise with Torsten. And also do remember that if you want to tweet about this event, and let's get some action on social media, the hashtag is @2020 End Child Poverty. Hashtag 2020 End Child Poverty. Right, I'm now going to invite Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation, and he's going to talk to us about how the different policy choices we make now affect child poverty in the future.
Great, thank you very much, Ayesha, and to everyone at CPAG for arranging this event and for reminding us all that child poverty was an issue even when it wasn't making the news headlines, that it is for very negative reasons today. Now I'm going to share some slides because that's what you get from the Resolution Foundation. You pay your money and you take your choice. So there should be some slides appearing on your screen today. And as I say, you know, the silver lining to the catastrophe that is this year is a renewed focus on child poverty, but it's an issue that over the last 10 years didn't go away and on many measures grew. And I'm going to mainly actually reinforce some of the points that Philippa's made, particularly on the need for the breadth of a strategy to deal with child poverty. And although I don't cover the politics of that in here, she's obviously also right to talk about the need for the breadth of the coalition to make that happen. So here's what I wanted to talk a bit about, which is that the stories we tell ourselves about child poverty and the stories that leads to in terms of policy need to reflect our actual experience. So I'm going to focus on the experience of the last 10 years to illustrate that. So to kick us off, look, I say that, if we can make the, oh, wait a second, everyone. You're getting some sneak peeks here due to IT challenges. That are occurring. While I wait for the slides to possibly catch up with the key buttons. Here we go. Right, let's try again. Okay, so look, the old story that I think has dominated our views of child poverty in policymaking circles in Britain rests on 2 principles. One is that the 1980s, which is basically the era that created the child poverty that we live with today in levels terms, doubling child poverty from 15 to 30%, that it is on the left here, those charts are showing, representing capitalism, that it is the nature of capitalism driving up child poverty. And then on the right-hand side, that it's the job of the Chancellor and central government to then attempt to keep that under control, in some areas successfully, the early 2000s, and in other areas not successfully. And that within that, we take for granted that absolute child poverty falls as our economy grows. Those are the 3-part stories that I think underpin most of how policymakers have thought about child poverty. Absolute poverty falling because economic growth happens. Secondly, relative child poverty being pushed up by the nature of that growth, i.e. higher inequality between the middle and the bottom, and that government's job is to push against that, to try and hold down that rise in child poverty. Now, what I want to say today is that that is a bad way of thinking about what's happened over the last decade, and that it's time we learn that lesson when we think about what our child poverty strategy looks like in the times to come. The first reason it is bad as a way of thinking about it is that it ignores the reality. So just focus here on the dotted blue lines on the right-hand side of this chart. And they're just reminding us that although relative poverty measures, the black line is what takes a lot of the attention, the progress in reducing absolute child poverty has completely stagnated for the last decade. We've seen a 1 percentage point fall. This should always be falling as our economy grows over time. That's why we rebase absolute measures of child poverty regularly. That has not happened over the last decade. And in fact, absolute child poverty, the number of people living below a fixed point, has actually gone up in some of the recent years. This is showing you 17-18, the uptick in absolute child poverty. And that is something that we, if I'm honest, didn't used to think was even an issue for policymakers, because we were used to, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, absolute poverty falling actually quite fast. But I think it's time we woke up to the reality that that is not what has been happening in Britain for some time. Now, why has absolute poverty not been falling in the way that we thought was just the norm? And that is because everybody's incomes in Britain have been squeezed since the financial crisis. The blue line here is showing you what happened to average pay. So it's not about poor workers in particular, this is average pay. And it just showing you that actually, even pre-COVID, we'd only just got back to the level of pay that we had before the financial crisis. That level of income squeeze is totally unprecedented in modern Britain, nothing like that we've ever seen before. One of the effects of that, as incomes have been squeezed, is that more people have chosen to work. 3 million more people working in just before COVID than were in 2008. The reason they are working is that we are all poorer and people are wanting to support their family incomes. And one of the effects of that, of those three, is that it's actually women and it's parents and women, who have driven almost all of that increase in employment. Second earners and single parents in particular are the big increases. There's also a big increase amongst older women for different reasons. But that general point, which is more women choosing to work because their family incomes have had a really tough time, is the defining feature of parental incomes over the last decade, and that is why absolute poverty has not been falling. Alongside that good news, though, on people being able to get jobs to support their family incomes, has also been, and by the way, it's poorer families who've seen the overwhelming majority of that employment increase, because that's the people who had the opportunity who weren't working full-time to start with. We've also seen progressive change on pay. So it's consistently now for the last 20 years been the lowest earners receiving the biggest pay rises in Britain, driven almost entirely by the national minimum wage and then the national living wage. So two very progressive things going on within the market economy: higher employment focused on the bottom and lowest earners getting the biggest pay rises across that pay. The first big fall in low pay for 4 decades happening in Britain over the last decade. But what we all know is that big employment rise is one of the reasons why we've seen the big change in what poverty is in Britain. I.e. it's working poverty. And this is just showing you what you all know. 70% of those in child poverty pre-crisis were in working households, compared to less than half 20 years ago. That is a huge change and means we need to force ourselves to rethink what our strategy looks like. But that increase in work and increase in pay for the bottom has been more than outweighed for low-income families by huge benefit cuts. £36 billion worth of cuts over the course of the pre-COVID period. That means taking a roughly 8% of the incomes of the poorest 20% of our society. That is why relative child poverty had been drifting up by 500,000 from 2013-14 onwards as those benefit cuts were rolled out. And it's why, even if we hadn't had a crisis of COVID, of a pandemic, we would be having a growing crisis of child poverty, because those cuts are being rolled out into the rest of the early part of this decade. So what the lessons for that, I think, about how we think about a child poverty strategy are that we need to that we are wrong that absolute poverty always falls, that we are wrong to think that abstract market forces are the thing that causes child poverty to rise always, that the capitalism is the problem in all times. It definitely is in some times, but in all times. And that the job of policy is just to keep that under control. That is not what we've seen. It's policy that has been the problem. And in fact, the opposite has also been true in this crisis. So just focus on the dotted lines on the left-hand chart, which is the relative poverty chart here, which is showing you that in the same way that benefit cuts drove up relative poverty for the second half of the decade we've just been through, in this crisis, this is based on our own modelling, so this is not as certain as the data I've shown you in the past slides, but that child poverty almost certainly actually fell this year. And before anyone says that's just being caused by the data not being right this year and because of the median incomes falling, it's not. The main thing doing this is the very large increase in benefits that the Chancellor announced at the beginning of this pandemic. And those have supported incomes at the bottom on average, not for everybody, but on average, families at the bottom to a huge extent. And that is the main driver of child poverty, relative child poverty probably falling this year, although we'll have to wait 2 years to see the actual data. So I just briefly want to say, like, what are the lessons for policymakers going forward from this? First, we really must not take falls in absolute poverty for granted. People that care about destitution, that want to campaign about poverty, economic growth is our problem. The fact that the economy has not been delivering rising living standards for too much, not just even before the financial crisis for some groups, is a huge problem. And that is that is not a big enough part of our conversations about poverty. This chart is showing you across the age distribution, so youngest on the left, oldest on the right. Obviously, children in this case isn't the money, it's their family income we're talking about here. I'm not talking about 4 or 5-year-olds going out to work. And it's showing you how that has increased between the 1990s and the mid-2000s. You know, decent income growth right across the age distribution. But since the middle of the 2000s, it is only amongst the older population that we've been seeing decent income growth. And while 70-year-olds used to be the poorest people in Britain, today it is children and it is families with young kids who are the poorest people in our country. That's why the green line is on the left is at its lowest point, and we've seen almost no growth for the last 20 years for those people, and that is what we should be focused on, and we need working age incomes to be growing to deal with that. Second, the fact that working poverty is the problem does not mean that work doesn't get people out of poverty. I think this is really important. I hear people talk too often as if work is the problem. Yes, too much low paid work is the problem, but getting a job is the best route out of poverty for lots of people. And this is showing you work we did last year, showing that if a household stays workless between years, only 1 in 5 households come out of poverty, but that rate doubles if somebody enters work. And it adds another 20% if a second adult goes into work in a household. So this is not saying that work doesn't get people out of poverty. It's saying that overall we need more income growth. And thirdly, poverty policy, government has to be part of the answer, not part of the problem. This is showing you what happens to families' incomes if we don't maintain the £20 a week coming next April. It's completely unconscionable, both from a macroeconomic perspective and from the perspective of the families affected. We'll be taking over 5% of the incomes of the bottom 20% of the population. That makes no sense at all and will reverse the fall in relative child poverty that I set out in the previous chart. So child poverty reduction needs us to focus on sorting out our economy and sorting out our benefit system, and both are important in the decade ahead. I'll wrap up there, Ayesha.
Thanks very much, Torsten. That's really, really helpful. And it was great to have those slides as well, just to sort of illustrate the points you're making. Thanks very much. I've just seen that Kate Green has joined us. So I think we're running a wee bit behind schedule, surprise, surprise, because we've got so much to talk about. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Kate to talk to us next, if that's all right, Kate, about what Labour's next child poverty strategy is going to look like, some of the kind of contours and thinking that you are doing with your team. And then what I'll do is I'll come to your questions afterwards and we'll put them to Philippa, Torsten and Kate. So Kate, I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed, Ayesha. Sorry to have missed what have undoubtedly been absolutely fascinating presentations. up till now. I'm very pleased to see it's all being recorded so I can watch them on playback, which will be a great treat this evening. And I'm really pleased to be able to say a little bit about, probably not at this stage a great deal about Labour's policy intentions. We are a long way from the next Labour government coming in after the next general election. And it's in a context of very, very volatile economic and social circumstances, obviously. So this is not the time for us to be able to say clearly what detailed policy would look like. But what I do want to say to you today is that as when we were last in office, when we made child poverty a national priority, and I want to pay tribute to everyone who helped to make that happen, and particularly to Gordon Brown, actually, who made a tremendous difference to this as Chancellor and Prime Minister. As in the last Labour government, when it was the central driving purpose of what we were doing in government, and we saw the results in terms of more than 1 million children being lifted out of relative poverty, it is absolutely our commitment again, and it is Keir Starmer's personal commitment as part of his vision of this country as the best country in the world to grow up in, that reducing and working to eliminate child poverty will again be central to a Starmer government. And I think, you know, it's very clear from our track record last time that it's not something that Labour signs up to for fair weather only. If you look at the continuing attention to an investment in child poverty strategies, even in the midst of the 2007-8 financial crisis, we took measures which ensured not only actually that the measures that helped us on the road to recovery out of that financial crisis and helped to secure families during it, but also meant that child poverty continued to fall even in those very difficult circumstances. And I think that also says to us a lesson that we will take back into government again in 2024. Something that we used to say again and again when I was at Child Poverty Action Group, and I know you would continue to say, is that child poverty isn't some inevitable force of nature. It is absolutely the consequence of political decisions. And if we make the right decisions, and if we're committed, and if we're dedicated, it can be eliminated, and we can do as well as the best of our comparator countries, something that we still fall very far short of. Of course, coming into government in the mid-2020s would mean that we would inherit a hugely difficult and damaging legacy of, first of all, 10 years of austerity, and then the consequences of the pandemic, and that's translating into obviously very worrying levels of job loss, wage stagnation, and austerity in particular having meant very, very significant cuts within social security provision. So it will be a very, very big challenge, I think, for an incoming government to address child poverty. But one that we are absolutely determined to rise to, and which we do not see as being a task for one bit of a Labour government, but for the whole of a Labour government. And that's why already in opposition, Keir has set up a shadow cabinet subcommittee co-chaired by Johnny Reynolds, our Work and Pensions Shadow Secretary, and me, and with other shadow cabinet colleagues, housing, treasury, equalities, and so on, because we know that we will need a whole government response to tackling child poverty and the multiple facets and aspects of the experience of child poverty, and that's something we're determined to do. But I want also to say to you, while saying that it will be a multifaceted approach, that one of the most important measures of our success will be the number of children that we can lift out of poverty over a 5-year period in office. That is the right measure, and the measure I think you would expect us to judge ourselves by. That will encompass, as we've been calling for during the pandemic, a more generous social security system, particularly to offer better support for families. We've already said that the 5-week wait, the 2-child limit, the benefit cap should all be suspended. And obviously equally crucially, and I just caught the tail end of what Torsten was saying, it's really important that we enable people to be in work, to stay in work, to get the training and skills to move on to higher wage jobs, and really to support parents to be able to provide for their children. And we also need to address some of the drivers, structural drivers of poverty. For example, the broken housing market, that means that in some areas, half of the wages of working people are simply going to meeting their housing costs, or a childcare system, again, where costs are rising faster than wages, and where support is disproportionately going to children from more advantaged households rather than their less affluent peers. So just really to wind up on this, Ayesha, as I say, Labour's child poverty strategy won't be the work of one or two people. It will be our whole, not just parliamentary party, our whole movement, and everybody in Britain who wants to work together to see an end to child poverty, and coming together to design the policy solutions that we're going to need in a very, very different context in 2024, 2025, than the context that the last Labour government started with at the end of the 1990s, when we embarked on a successful child poverty strategy last time. And that's what we will really have to take account of, but we will always be asking ourselves in relation to every piece of policy, what will it do for children and families across the country, and will it reduce their poverty and increase life chances? And I personally have a huge amount invested in this remaining central to Labour's purpose in government. But it is something that I think animates our whole Labour movement, and that we will be very, very excited to work with you as stakeholders on. We can bring child poverty to an end. We know how we do it. I believe that if we work together, we will do it. I very much look forward to your ideas and input as we start to develop in detail the kind of policies that we believe will help to bring it about.
Thank you, Kate. Great to hear some of that early thinking. Obviously, as you say, you're very far away from the next election and a manifesto, but good to get some of that early thinking. Of course, many of you will know Kate not just now as her excellent position as Shadow Secretary of State for Education, but in a previous life she was very much steeped in this community, and of course was former CEO of the Child Poverty Action Group. Right, if you've got any questions for Kate, do pop it in the Q&A box. Now I'm going to go back and do some questions now to the others. Now, Philippa, we've got a question from you, and this is from someone who's anonymous, who says that you're dead right about poverty wages. What is your advice to us to encourage employers to pay proper wages, and are you advocating a much higher minimum wage?
Thank you, Ayesha, for that. I think it's been really interesting to watch the public's reaction as during this pandemic. And I think a number of speakers have said, and Alison mentioned this too, that the public mood has changed. And people don't want to see children in poverty. People want to be part of the solution to that. I think one of the reasons why so many people have wanted to volunteer at food banks, for example, during this time, is they want to be part of the solution. They want to be doing something about this. And there are lots of employers out there who actually, if you put this challenge to them and you said to them, have you ever really thought through how your employees can provide for their families on the wages that you are giving them, they would actually want to do something about this. And I'm a complete advocate for tax credits. I think they've been, they've been a great addition to the expanding welfare state. But in effect, their presence has meant that the market at the bottom end is broken. And people don't actually know what an actual wage should be at the bottom end of the market. We often talk about the market should set the wage, but actually on low income, that doesn't really happen anymore. So I would say that there's a lot that can be done through a voluntary response to this, which actually then would change a culture, because once you've got some big employers doing this, others would follow suit as well. You've seen that with the living wage, which started off as a campaign and then got adopted into government, obviously not as the full living wage, but you see a change beginning to happen and people understanding that the wage that you pay a family is really critical to that family being in or out of poverty. There's just one other thing I want to add to the issue of wages. We talk a lot about in-work poverty and out-of-work poverty. And over the last few years, we have seen a rise in work poverty, but that's also because we've seen a huge transition of people from out of work into work. And to begin with, the work that they took often was part-time. And so we've seen that what we've seen is that it takes 2 full-time wages to get a family out of poverty, and part-time wages are a stepping stone, but they're not the end point.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Torsten, next question is for you from Sophia Parker. When it comes to living standards for kids in poverty, which is the more pressing issue to tackle? Low wages or job and income security? I know both matter, but where would you put the campaigning firepower? Great question, thanks.
Well, the British fashion at the moment is cake and eat it. So I'm going to bank the fact that we are having, I think it's now political consensus that the minimum wage should continue to increase. The government's got a target of abolishing low pay by the middle of this decade. I don't think, while COVID will mean that is a lower level in cash terms, I don't think as things stand today, there's a reason for abandoning that target. And that is a very high minimum wage compared to international standards. It will put us up there with the French and with New Zealand. No one else will really be close out of large developed countries. So that's happening. So I think the exam question that we need to all confront is the minimum wage will not do this, will not do all of this. Okay, and there's a number of reasons why it won't do all of it. But I don't want to disagree about things, but I don't agree in general that wages at the bottom are being pushed down by tax credits. I think the academic evidence doesn't say that is what has happened here and in the US, particularly because of the minimum wage, actually. But so I don't think these things are intention. But the things that need to sit alongside a minimum wage and benefits policy are that we need to care more about the hours people work. And in particular, one of the things, like in the end, for child poverty, it's weekly wages, not hourly wages, which is what the minimum wage affects, that matters for poverty, because that's what drives your living standards. And if we look over the last 30 years, we can't help but reflect that actually the change in the hours worked, lower hours at the bottom end for women and men, and higher hours for higher income families being worked, is one of the things pushing up on inequality and pushing up on poverty. And we haven't confronted that, and we need to recognize, and if you look at who wants more hours work in Britain today, it's poorer families that want them. That was not the case in the 1950s, where the longest hours were worked by the single earner in a family, in a poor family. And I think we've got to recognize that we need to give people control of the hours they work. Like, Britain is very unusual in being a place where an employer can ring somebody up on the way into the office to change their shift patterns. Like, why is there no minimum notice period for the shifts? Why do we have so many contracts that basically don't set the actual number of hours you actually work? It's not just about 0 hours contracts, short hour contracts as well. So policy needs to move on to issues of power and control of our work, not just focusing on the minimum wage. But I'm only saying that because I'm confident we're going to get the minimum wage rise. So I want cake and I want to eat it.
Oh, we all want that at the moment. We like lots of fudge, and we also like cake and eat it. And we like fish. We're really into fish at the moment as well, but let's not go down that cul-de-sac. Kate, a question for you has come in from John Dalton, and he says, Kate, while Labour is still formalising policy, is a universal basic income one of the options under consideration?
You're absolutely right about fish, Ayesha. I've just come from the Shadow Cabinet where we spent 20 minutes discussing them. I know so much more about fish than I did first thing this morning. I think, to be honest, John, personal opinion, but probably one that quite a lot of people will understand. I am a bit of a UBI skeptic. If it were significantly to impact on poverty reduction, it would have to be accompanied by headline tax rates that I think would be politically probably unsustainable, certainly very, very difficult to persuade the electorate that they would accept. And if it's set at a lower level than able to make a significant impact on poverty, then I think there are other better ways to use the money to achieve a greater outcome. And of course, people use UBI as a brand without necessarily specifying exactly what they mean to be in it or out of it. But there is a particular issue about where you see higher rates of poverty among, for example, families with disabled family members, among families living in high-cost housing areas, which in its crude form at least, and I recognise you can design variants, but in its crude form at least, universal basic income can't address. So it's not my starting point. I think it had some appeal, and I would recognise this, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, in that it would have been a simple, ready backstop for families in a time of utter income chaos. It achieved some currency earlier on this year in that context. And it may be that there are ways in which our social security system could be better designed to put that certainty, that backstop of income in place in a cost-effective way in case we're in this appalling crisis again. But if I were really interested in universal income solutions, and I don't rule them out entirely, it would be in child benefit. It would be in income for families with children. And there are all sorts of reasons why universal child benefit was and could still be such a useful benefit in helping to address child poverty. The fact that it's paid to the main carer, therefore much, much more likely to be spent on the needs of the children. The fact that it's portable, so even as family circumstances change, that main carer knows that that child benefit remains a reliable income source. The fact that it's if it is universal, there's no stigma in claiming it. That leads to very, very high levels of take-up, and that it's very simple to claim. So again, that contributes to excellent take-up. Now, I have to say, we haven't got a policy on child benefit or indeed on any particular overall design for the social security for the next election. I am very conscious of people probably on this call and elsewhere who are lobbying Labour very hard on it. May I encourage you to continue to do so, and to say that you definitely have some strong advocates for it in the Labour Party.
Okay, read between the lines on that. Thanks very much. Torsten, very quickly, I could see you shaking your head about universal basic income. Do you just want to come back very, very quickly on that? I could see you pulling a face.
No, I'm saying, look, the nature of this crisis. No, leave aside all the usual arguments about UBI, where Kate is right that one is only vaguely feasible if you're prepared to either increase poverty significantly or to have a very, very, very much higher tax take. The issue about this crisis, I think, that we need to understand is that because the crisis is so sectorally unequal, it's so focused on hospitality, a UBI is not a good way to try and deal with the macroeconomics or the family needs during this crisis, because if you use that kind of untargeted support to push demand into the economy during a crisis, what you don't do is get sufficient support to the people whose incomes are getting hammered in the hard hit sectors. And the result is you end up with very bad outcomes for them as families, and the macroeconomics is a turkey. So my strong view is that it's really important that our economic policy is based on what's actually happening in a crisis, not what was fashionable, which was a UBI at the beginning of this crisis. That would have been a very, very bad policy outcome. You would have been higher unemployment, and it would have been more destitute families. So I almost never in life disagree with Kate Green, because it's a dangerous thing I found to do. But on the idea that the UBI would have been a good idea at the beginning of this crisis, I think that is people paying more attention to what they think is important, and I've always thought was important, rather than to the nature of this crisis. And that might be okay in a boom time, but it is a really dumb idea in a crisis.
I think, to be fair to Kate, she didn't actually say she was
No,
not just really good. She said she could
I
see
know,
the appeal.
that's why I'm gently disagreeing, because she was being
Yes,
very polite, so I'm being less polite than Kate.
Yeah, I'm entirely at one with what Torsten says.
Yes,
but,
okay, whereas one, whatever.
But it did have some popular momentum behind it for a time.
So does hanging, it turns out. But
there was a lot of chat about. I think hanging is a bit extreme, Torsten. But okay, I've got a question for Philippa quickly. So I want to just get through two more questions. One for Philippa and one for Kate. So Philippa, someone has messaged in saying, I wholeheartedly agree with Philippa that this must be a cross-party fight. But how do we encourage government and their MPs to support the fight when they have so readily voted for cuts and are, with some honourable exceptions, silent on, for example, the need to keep the extra £20 of that universal credit payment that we talked about early. So would just do a quick response on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ayesha. I am so convinced that this has to be cross-party. I can remember when I was in government and we were working with the Liberal Democrats in coalition, and you'd have all of these rows about poverty, you know, externally, but behind closed doors, the level of agreement was just extraordinary. And I can then remember when Alan Milburn became chair of the Child Poverty and Social Mobility Commission, there'd be all these rows externally, and yet behind closed doors, there'd be so much that we would actually agree on. And I found that doing the work of the Social Metrics Commission, bringing left and right together, we've actually been able to really agree on a lot of things. And there will always be things, you know, at the margins that are precious to different parties. But the bulk of what needs to be done, we wholeheartedly agree on, and to protect a strategy in the long term so that disadvantaged families don't have like loads of income for 5 years and then it all taken away again and then put back again and then taken away again, which is hugely disruptive. We need to come together. So absolutely. Secondly, there are lots of Conservatives who are passionate about these issues. I regularly share platforms, you know, with people like Stephen Crabb. I know someone like John Glenn is passionate about these. He's a minister at the Treasury. You know, that there are there's a caucus of Conservative MPs, 70 of them in Parliament, who are passionate about these issues. We must learn to work together. And the £20 uplift, we published a paper just a couple of weeks ago, and the purpose of publishing the paper was to say, well done to the government. 700,000 people have been protected by the £20 uplift, and the purpose of doing it was for Conservative voices to come out and say, this is a good thing, keep going.
Great, thank you so much for that, Philippa. Kate, I want to squeeze in one very quick question to you because it's a really important topic. Do you mind just being quite brief in your response? We've got one more speaker to sort of get through, and that's from Jane Van Zyl. And the question is, how do we square the circle of getting parents back into work to reduce poverty with managing their childcare responsibilities?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially now when actually we know that the childcare market is under a lot of pressure, and a significant proportion of providers, because of funding challenges, are saying that they may have to shut up shop over the next 12 months, and therefore there will be even more pressure on supply. So obviously it's about the creation of places and sustaining childcare places. And that is about having a funding model which is reliable, which is adequate, which is actually simple. I think, you know, we still have an absolute multiplicity of funding streams that are very confusing for parents and for providers. And that is fair, that actually makes sure that we direct childcare funding to meet the needs of low-income families, children who can particularly benefit from really high quality childcare and early years settings, and of course supporting parents into employment. And just one other thing I'd say, Ayesha, which is that it's obviously childcare is a very, very big piece of the jigsaw, but so too is what's happening in the workplace, and flexible working and the ability for parents to have that entitlement to flexible working is really important. I do think that we have faced both an opportunity and a bit of a challenge coming out of COVID, that we've become more accustomed to working from home. I think that will translate after COVID into increasingly families working on a blended basis, some working at home, some going into the office on some days. The real concern I have about that is that that will become a sort of proxy for, well, mum's at home a couple of days a week, so she won't need childcare on those days. Now, it is true that that extra flexibility will be very welcome to families and indeed to probably a lot of workers. But I think we've got to be really clear that having mum at home because she's working at home in a new, different kind of working model doesn't mean that her time is therefore available to provide the kind of childcare quality and attention and commitment that actually we are talking about when a child is in a very good, high quality childcare setting, nor will it help mum to work, frankly. So I think we've got to be very, very alert to this, because I do see this as becoming a way in which childcare could start to slip down the agenda a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And also we do know that women are really getting hit quite hard by this pandemic in terms of the double whammy of more caring responsibilities and of course more pressures on working from home. I know I'm being really naughty and pushing this, but I just create one more very quick question. This is just for me. What is your view on the issue of schools closing at the moment, particularly in London?
We've been dead clear all the way through since I came into post that we believe schools should remain open, that children should be in school, that it's the best place for their learning, obviously, for their socio-emotional well-being. It's really important from a safeguarding point of view. We saw in the spring lockdown vulnerable children who should have been in school but didn't attend. They disappeared below the radar. The Chief Inspector of Ofsted has shown just how very dangerous that has been in terms of their well-being and their safety. Obviously, we're nearly at the Christmas holidays. I think it's pretty unhelpful, if I may say so, for this to have resulted in the Secretary of State issuing a legal instruction to London authorities. I don't see why they can't just get round the table and negotiate a sensible way through the last couple of days of term. The issue is actually less about infection spread in schools than about staff shortages, because staff are at home isolating. What I'm absolutely clear about, Ayesha, is that even if schools do close a day or two early as we come to the end of this term, children must be back in school in January. It is the best place for them to be. And I am pleased that finally we do seem to have some plans coming forward for the rollout of mass testing for secondary schools and for teachers. That I think is going to be really key to enabling schools to keep their staff in school. If they're testing negative every day, they can carry on teaching and we can keep kids in class. And it is really, really important that that's what we do for children's long-term prospects and short-term safety and well-being.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. Very useful to get that view, and I think you're absolutely right about the mass testing. Well, my huge thanks to Baroness Philippa Stroud from the Legatum Institute, to Torsten Bell from the Resolution Foundation, and Kate Green, who of course is Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Education. Thanks for all your really thoughtful questions as well. I thought it was a really, really illuminating session. Thank you for all your time. Now we're coming to the end of our session, and our final speaker, it's brilliant to have him with us making his contribution. Ben Lomas is a member of the Youth Parliament for St Helens. And Ben is an ardent, passionate and compassionate campaigner against child poverty. And Ben is going to speak to us now about what his hopes are from the future. We've listened to a lot of people, no disrespect, who are a bit on the older side. I include myself. I'm now well into my middle age, particularly today. But let's hear from the sort of other end of the telescope, somebody who is very much in the zone which is really been impacted by this. And we're going to hear from Ben about what his hopes are for the future. Ben Lomas, over to you.
Thank you, Ayesha, and good morning, everyone. My name's Ben Lomas. I'm the Member of Youth Parliament for St Helens, and I'm 15 years old. I wanted to talk today. It's an honour to speak at the webinar for this charity, a charity that's obviously helped so many young people and done some great work over the years of its existence. Throughout my term as an MYP for St Helens in Merseyside, I've campaigned to tackle child poverty, and I've worked closely with CPAG to achieve our common goal of tackling this issue. In my area of St Helens alone, over 30% of young people live in poverty, a picture that mirrors what's going on nationally. This Christmas, some of the most vulnerable children in society will suffer. It is morally egregious that over 4 million of our nation's children will have to face the constant struggle of wondering where the next meal is going to come from, facing the cold in unfit accommodation and clothing, and contending with the possibility of lower attainment in education. And this doesn't even account for the additional problem of hidden poverty. It was great to see Marcus Rashford raising the profile of the wider issue of poverty this year, but whilst the subsequent government U-turn was a step in the right direction, we must demand more change to ensure that this issue is tackled once and for all. It should have been this year that poverty was eradicated, and yet instead we face once more the rising tide of austerity rearing its ugly head. Despite this, we must not allow for ourselves to fall into the trap of thinking that child poverty can't or shouldn't be tackled. Our young people deserve better, and their light must not be extinguished. We must see measurable, wide-scale change to tackle child poverty, and with this government's current anti-poverty strategy ending this year, we must call for a new one. I believe that the government should adopt a new and fully resourced anti-poverty strategy with young people at its heart, as I set out in my motion to the UK Youth Parliament this year. A strategy that delivers on ensuring that there is consistent free school meal provision over the half terms, increases the £30 education maintenance allowance, scraps the outdated 2-child limit for universal credit, and provides a suitable redress to the current housing crisis, whereby minimum space standards are forcing families into homes that are unaffordable alternatives, and a growing number of families are increasingly living in temporary homeless accommodation. It's through bold steps like this that I believe we can truly end this vicious cycle. We all now have the opportunity to define our young people's future, because the actions today will define the outcomes of tomorrow. I'm hopeful that we can be the change that we want to see and force our decision makers to take action. I'm hopeful that partisan politics will be set aside and we can work together for the common good. And I am hopeful, above all, for a future where no child has a disadvantaged start in life just because of their financial background, because no child has caused poverty. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Ben Lomas. Really inspiring words, and I hope that you're going to be one of the leaders of the future, because this can't just be solved for people of sort of our age. We do need to get more people of your age as well involved in this. So thanks so much for speaking to us today. Well, that's it for the session today. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to all our guests, and thank you to the Child Poverty Action Group for bringing this really, really important event together. As I said at the beginning, it's incredibly vital and it's massively timely because of the pandemic. It's been pretty sober in the fact that we've had lots of discussions about how inequalities are being heightened, but I hope you'll feel that there was a note of optimism there, particularly in terms of what Alison said at the beginning, that public attitudes on this are shifting because of the pandemic and because of campaigns like the one that Marcus Rashford did. I hope that we'll all get involved, and I suppose today we'll ask you to make a pledge to stand with children, make some noise about this, call on government to take action. As Baroness Stroud said, this must be a cross-party initiative. Call on and have discussions with MPs from all different parts of the political spectrum, and we've got to really make the simple message get out there that we have to end child poverty once and for all, and that it can be done, and that it is a political choice. Now, there'll be lots of details about how you can get involved. If you there's going to be an email that's sent out, and you can also get access to the book that the Child Poverty Action Group has published, 2020 End Child Poverty. And yeah, we've just got to sort of keep this topic on the horizon, because I think one of the stories of the pandemic is, understandably, we've focused a lot on older vulnerable people, which is absolutely right, but we mustn't forget about children at the other end of the story. So don't forget to tweet about the event, hashtag 2020 End Child Poverty, and do get involved with the ongoing campaign. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a real pleasure to host this event. Have a good day. Bye-bye.